I'm Bob Bradley from the Pampered Cruiser, and if you're considering taking a trip on Oceania or any other small ship, ocean, river, or expedition ship, then we'd love to help you out with your plans. This video is about a 12-day journey we took through Greece and Turkey on the Oceania Riviera, but all the cruise lines do some variation of this cruise, so some of the port stops will undoubtedly be the same. When you embark on your cruise in Athens, the port logistics are actually fairly easy. The port for Athens is called Piraeus, and it's about a 20-minute taxi or Uber ride from the Athens city center, or about 40 minutes from the airport. On our day of embarkation, there were several ships in port, but it didn't feel overwhelmed or crowded. It only took a few minutes to get on board the ship, and after eating lunch in one of the many spectacular restaurants on Oceania, they announced that our room was ready. Volos is the setting for many of the remarkable tales in Greek mythology, so today we're wandering around looking for clues from Zeus about where to find centaurs, and we need to be cautious because apparently centaurs can be quite ill-tempered. We're also visiting a series of monasteries today, one of which you may recognize from Roger Moore's 1981 outing as James Bond. Agent 007 scaled the rock cliff to get to the buildings at the top. We, on the other hand, took a motor coach most of the way and then climbed the last 200 stairs for the last furlong. Unlike Commander Bond, nobody was shooting at us or otherwise conspiring for us to plunge to our deaths, at least that I'm aware of. So we had the opportunity to take in the incredible views of this place that 007 really didn't get to enjoy. You can cue the Sheena Easton music theme song to get the full effect, and I would have done that for you, except the YouTube cops would be all over me to pay royalties. Once back on the ship, a small group of us dined at Privé, the intimate chef's table restaurant, where we were offered a 7-course meal with wine pairings. If you'd like more detail on Oceania's culinary program, we've posted a separate video specifically about all the restaurant offerings on board, and that link is in the notes below. Kavala is not a common port stop for cruise ships, so we were a bit of a novelty in the local community today. I don't really know how they spotted us, a group of 20 or so people, all speaking English, wearing baseball caps and carrying backpacks. If that doesn't scream tourist, I'm not clear what does. I suppose one needs to embrace one's inner tourist in cases such as this. We were able to do a hike cut out of the mountainside along a flowing river where in previous centuries tobacco farmers traveled. Today it was a nice respite from eating too much on board the ship and wandering around more urban settings. It was also a powerful reminder of how different cultures perceive liability differently than we do. I can't imagine an American tour company allowing a bunch of unfit middle-aged tourists to walk on an uneven donkey track with no guardrails. It was then on to the historic city of Xanthi. This entire region has alternatively been part of Turkey or Greece for century-long stretches at a time. In the 1920s, there was a refugee swap between the Turks and the Greeks, and this city was almost entirely re-inhabited by those Greek migrants coming from parts of Turkey. The old mansions once housed wealthy tobacco merchants, but now most of them are public buildings. Istanbul is an intersection. The intersection between Europe and Asia, the intersection of Islam and Christianity, the intersection of the ancient and the modern, the intersection of the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Black Sea. Istanbul is also huge, over 15 million people, and it's crowded, particularly on a summer weekend. Sue and I would normally get around a city like this by public transit or a taxi in a pinch. And when I asked Google Maps for directions to the Blue Mosque, we were told that it was a 35-minute taxi ride or a 25-minute walk. I decided that that couldn't possibly be right as we hopped into the cab. Never doubt Siri, I thought to myself as I pressed my face against the window in the back seat of the taxi, watching with envy as the pedestrians routinely made it to the next intersection before we did. Eventually we arrived at Topkapi Palace, quickly discovering that this site really would require an entire day to see in any depth. We chose to visit the harem, one of several sections in this massive site. The harem is where the Sultan, his mother, and his wives and children lived. I tried to think of something clever to say here about having several wives, but I can't find anything that wouldn't generate a whole bunch of hate mail. No visit to Turkey is complete without a visit to a bazaar, so it might as well be the Grand Bazaar. Oddly, it felt a little bit more like a crowded shopping mall than it did a cultural experience. And we quickly moved on to the spice market, and the strong aroma of exotic spices and unusual fruits and vegetables made this one a little bit more interesting. Oceania has made this a 2-day stop, so we're not running back to the ship and can get to enjoy this fascinating city at night. We found a local family-run Turkish restaurant for an early dinner before taking in a display of the whirling dervish. This is a local and authentic experience, and one that is a spiritual exercise for the performers, and as such I don't have any photos and will instead have to remember it in my mind's eye. 5 men with musical accompaniment sing, pray, and spin continuously for 45 minutes. If it sounds a bit strange, well, it was. And it was also something a little bit more substantial than the Disneyfied perceptions of the Middle East that we normally experience. Because we're here overnight, we're able to explore Istanbul at night by taking a walk through the local area and having a glass of wine on one of the many rooftop patios. A second day allowed us to see a few more things because yesterday we really only scratched the surface. Learning our lesson about getting around by car yesterday, we set out early and walked up from the cruise ship port up the hill to Hagia Sophia. After a brisk 40-minute, mostly uphill walk in humid 80-degree-plus heat, I'm sure we entered this holy site looking like Keith Richards the morning after an all-night bender. This mosque was the largest church in the world up until the 16th century and today serves as both a museum and a mosque. It's closed several times a day so that practicing Muslims can attend to pray. Both the history and the architecture of this building are incredible. We spent our afternoon on a leisurely stroll through Istanbul, stopping for lunch, cool drinks, and at some of the shops as we worked our way back towards the ship. The part of Istanbul we're in is geographically within Europe, and it shares the European propensity for great public spaces. There's lots of parks and dedicated pedestrian spaces. Istanbul is a medium-frequency cruise ship port, meaning that it doesn't have as much traffic as Athens, Barcelona, or Rome, but still relatively busy. The cruise ship port that they have built is clearly anticipating more traffic. It's brand new, huge, and quite impressive. It's also a reasonable walk to many of the attractions in Istanbul. But before we headed back to the ship for departure, we had to stop for a Turkish delight in the pedestrian mall right near the cruise ship terminal. The modern town of Kusadasi has about 120,000 people with many more tourists in the summer months and is the gateway to one of the most important ancient Greek ruin sites at Ephesus. Ephesus was first settled in the 10th century BC, where it was an important site for both the ancient Greeks and the Romans who also settled here. It contains the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and also the famous Library of Celsus. The amphitheater built here is estimated to have held 24,000 people. Today, people flock here not only for its archaeological significance for the Greek and Roman ruins, but also to visit the Virgin Mary's house and to visit the place where it is believed the Gospel of John was written. Ephesus is always very busy, and for those that have already been here, or just looking for something different, the area in and around Kusadasi has lots of other things to offer. Luckily, our itinerary puts us in Kusadasi for 2 days, so we've got time to explore beyond just Ephesus. The Ephesus Museum is not far from the archaeological site and has far fewer visitors. The irony here is that many of the original artifacts are contained in the less visited museum, where there are replicas in place at the site of Ephesus itself. A bit further into the mountains is a small local village called Sarins. There, we just wandered the streets and connected with local merchants, including one that made us a traditional Turkish coffee. Imagine the thickest espresso you've ever tried, heated over a kiln of sand. It's served with pomegranate juice, so you can alternate between the bitter coffee and the sweet juice. Sitting under a tree in the shade, sipping on Turkish coffee seemed like a pretty good option today. Another day, another UNESCO World Heritage Site. It makes you realize how rich in history and culture this Mediterranean region really is. Today we got even further afield, out to the Greek ruin site of Hierapolis, which translated means holy city. It's also at the Pamukkale, a fascinating natural hot spring area. The Turks have managed to harness some of that green energy as well, with several geothermal power production facilities in the region. They seem to be everywhere along the highway as we drove out. Pamukkale is a natural hot spring area that has been operating as a spa since the 2nd century. So there, Canyon Ranch. The snow-white limestone has been formed from the calcium-rich hot springs that run through the area and give the water a bright blue color. It really is quite a spectacle. The ancient city of Hierapolis was also built here, and I can only assume for the same reason the Fairmont hotel chain builds huge infrastructure near hot springs, to attract the tourists. Mission accomplished, both in the ancient world and more recently, like today, for example. The Apostle Philip spent the last few years of his life here, and today there were several hundred people visiting the site. It's not nearly as crowded as Ephesus, but still busy. Much like Ephesus, there's a huge outdoor amphitheater that holds nearly 20,000 people, and there's a museum that documents the artifacts that are unearthed here. Unlike Ephesus, you can go for a swim or just stroll through the water of the hot springs. Nothing quite as refreshing as 102-degree water on a 104-degree day. When you think of the Greek islands, you probably think of turquoise water lapping up on white sand beaches with old Greek fishermen dotting the seashore. Small family-run tavernas with blue chairs dot the crooked cobblestone streets that are wedged between ancient Greek ruins. You wander aimlessly through the streets and occasionally have to jump out of the way if an impatient local zips past on her scooter. That is Rhodes. The only thing missing was Aristotle Onassis' yacht moored out in the harbor. There are no sea days on this itinerary, so it's very busy. Rhodes, also known as Rhodos, is a charming Greek island and is a great place to have a more relaxed day. We opted out of any organized excursions today and instead just wandered through the township. The first thing you notice about Rhodes is the walls that envelop the township and the castle that seems to be visible from everywhere. The place has been occupied by everyone, seriously. In ancient times it was the Athenians, the Romans, and then the Persians. Alexander the Great, the Byzantines, and the Ottomans all left a mark here. Even the modern Italians occupied this place in the early 20th century. And it's easy to see why. What a lovely place. Santorini is perhaps one of the most picturesque places in the world. It also can be a bit of a poster child for over-tourism. In addition to Riviera, there were two other big megaships in port today, so we didn't really expect to have the place all to ourselves. Luckily, a bit of contrarian thinking and a good pair of walking shoes minimized the crowds for us. The ships disgorge their guests at the town of Fira. The tender boats ferry people to shore, and then they ride the gondola up to overwhelm Fira, so we still steered clear of there. Luckily, the island of Santorini has other places to visit. We chose a shore excursion that would get us up to the highest point of the island for some spectacular views, and also bragging rights for negotiating the most dodgy road I think I've ever been on in a motor coach. Here's a hint, don't look out the front window while the bus is in motion. It was then over to Ia, where we took our leave of the group on the shore excursion after enjoying the commentary of a local guide and seeing some of the sights from the bus. Ia and Fira are about 8 miles apart. About halfway between these two busy villages is Emiroviglia. What'd you call me? Yeah, Emiroviglia is every bit as scenic as Fira or Ia, but for whatever reason, not quite as busy. We took some photos because there's eye candy everywhere, had some lunch, and hiked Scaros Rock. We then walked back through Fira and down the track with all the donkeys to get to the ship's tender. This was a long walk, but seemed like a much better idea than waiting for more than an hour for a ride on the gondola to get down the side of the caldera. Met some nice donkeys en route too. If you enjoyed this video, then give us a thumbs up, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you want more information specifically about Oceania cruises, then see our Riviera ship tour video and our special presentation on Oceania's culinary program. If you're interested in traveling with Oceania or any other small ship, ocean, river, or expedition cruise line, then please get in touch. Here's our contact information, and it's also included in the notes below. Thanks for watching.